Okay, let's get into this. We're doing a deep dive today into a story that, on the surface, looked like a perfect picture of harmony. You had the smiles, the handshakes, a big celebration of continental unity.
Right. But underneath all of that, that very shiny veneer, a really massive high-stakes confrontation was brewing, both political and economic.
And the backdrop for this showdown is, well, it's the most unlikely place you could imagine. The 2026 FIFA World Cup, which is supposed to be jointly hosted by the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
What a setting for a major dispute. I mean, you're right, the World Cup was meant to be the ultimate symbol of this North American partnership.
And instead,
Instead, it became the very stage where a major economic fracture started to unfold, mainly between Washington and Ottawa. It was a confrontation that was basically hidden in plain sight.
so our mission today, for you, the listener, is really crucial if you want to understand the tension that's happening in North America right now. We're going to look past that televised ceremony.
We have to.
We need to analyze the political theater of that World Cup draw. We'll detail the truly crushing economic impact of these tariffs the U.S. has imposed, and, maybe most importantly, understand the quiet, calculated rejection that Canada delivered.
And that rejection, as subtle as it was, could fundamentally restructure North American economic relations, maybe for a generation.
So to really get a feel for the tension, we have to set the scene. Take us back to December 5th.
Okay, so the official World Cup draw ceremony is being held at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. It's this magnificent, iconic venue.
And the visuals, the optics, they were absolutely perfect, weren't they? I mean, it looked like it was designed to project strength and unity.
Completely. You had the three leaders, President Trump, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, all sitting right there together.
Smiling, shaking hands, looking like the picture of three unified countries ready to host the world's biggest sporting event.
And the staging, I mean, it couldn't have been more theatrical. President Trump arrives, and he's immediately given this newly invented Peace Prize.
A peace prize.
It seemed to be created just for him, for this specific occasion. He sat right at the center of the diplomatic seating. The visual was absolute, unquestionable continental partnership. It was a flawless piece of political choreography for the cameras.
But you're saying that despite the smiles, the spectacle, the invented prizes, the reality behind the scenes was one of deep confrontation.
Precisely. That perfect visual was, it was deceptive. The story the camera showed was only half the truth. While those leaders were watching the soccer balls being drawn, a silent diplomatic standoff was happening.
And what's the twist?
The twist that matters most is this. One of those leaders, Prime Minister Carney, had absolutely no intention of giving President Trump what he so clearly wanted during that visit.
So this whole jovial atmosphere was just masking a really calculated move by Canada. Let's dive into that, because it really goes against every instinct you'd think a close partner would have when they're facing that kind of pressure.
That's right. And this brings us to our first section, the calculated refusal. This wasn't, a reactive decision made on the fly. It was a preemptive, strategic move by the Canadian delegation.
They controlled the narrative before they even landed.
They controlled the scope of the conversation, yes.
So what did they do specifically to lock down the focus of the trip like that?
Well, before Prime Minister Carney even boarded his plane, his office made it crystal clear to the press, and crucially, to Washington, that the visit would focus only on the soccer celebration.
Only soccer.
Yes. The Canadian Minister for U.S. Relations, Dominic LeBlanc, he stated it explicitly. Tariffs, high-stakes trade talks, all of it was off the table for the day. It was a very clear signal.
So they're essentially saying, we are here for the World Cup draw, and that is it. I mean, considering the state of trade relations at that moment, that is an incredibly bold, almost defiant stance to take.
It is absolutely defiant. And think about the gravity of the situation for a moment. Canada is flying into the U.S. Capitol knowing the entire framework of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. We call it CUSMA.
The core trade pact for the whole continent.
Exactly. It's hanging by a thread. And yet, they refuse to initiate negotiations, even when sitting just inches away from the primary decision maker.
Which makes those 2 hours they spent side by side during the ceremony just pure political theater.
Utterly.
They're smiling, they're chatting, watching the draw, but all the while, Carney is strategically, deliberately refusing to start any conversation about these crushing new tariffs or the CUSMA deadline that's looming.
It was a message of profound resolve. It signaled that Canada would not be bullied or coerced into some emergency, poorly prepared meeting just because the U.S. demanded it.
They chose to wait,
They chose to wait for a time when they could negotiate on their own terms. Or maybe not at all.
Okay, to really understand the weight of that refusal, we have to look at what prompted it. What had President Trump done just days before that made this so critical?
Context is everything here.
Ah.
Just 2 days before that draw, the president had publicly, openly mused about letting CUSMA expire. Just letting it die.
And this is the continent's most important, most foundational trade deal.
It links hundreds of billions of dollars in commerce. Threatening to walk away from CUSMA isn't just a political gesture. It's threatening to detonate the economic stability of all of North America.
So if you're Prime Minister Carney, you're flying into Washington right after the U.S. president suggests tearing up the rulebook that underpins, what, a quarter of your entire national economy?
25% of GDP, yes.
The pressure must have been immense, from business leaders, provincial leaders back home. Pressure to offer something, to re-engage immediately, just to show good faith. But he held firm.
He did. And the proof is in the details of their private discussion. The three leaders, Trump, Carney, and Sheinbaum, they did eventually meet privately for about 45 minutes, away from the cameras.
So what was the big breakthrough?
There wasn't one. I remember the reports. They agreed only to keep working together on the trade agreement.
That phrase, it's a masterpiece of diplomatic evasion, isn't it?
It is. When world leaders announce they've agreed to keep working together, it is the clearest possible sign that the conversation stalled. It means they couldn't agree on a framework, no pathway forward, and certainly no specific concessions.
So the absence of a concrete announcement was the announcement.
Exactly. And the U.S. side even had to confirm that lack of progress, right?
I did.
The failure to re-engage was confirmed publicly afterwards by the U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Hockra. He admitted the president did not reinitiate the negotiating process during that meeting.
So Carney's strategy worked. Refusing to put trade on the agenda, holding a position of strength? It succeeded, even at the risk of the most important trade pact in modern history. That's a massive gamble.
A huge gamble. And one with enormous potential consequences. Which brings us to the actual economic reality behind all those smiles. We need to ground this in the sheer scale of what was at risk.
The stakes could genuinely not be higher.
They couldn't. Before we detail the tariffs themselves, we have to understand the interdependence. I mean, the U.S. and Canada, we often talk about them as friendly neighbors. But economically, they're fundamentally braided together.
Just how foundational is that relationship for Canada?
It's existential. For Canada, a staggering 75% of its entire national exports go directly to the United States.
75%.
And to put that number in perspective for you, that flow of goods represents roughly 25% of Canada's entire gross domestic product.
Yeah.
Its entire national income.
So 1/4 of Canada's economic lifeblood relies entirely on that single customer.
Exactly. And the volume is just dizzying. We are talking about $2.5 billion worth of goods and services crossing that shared border every single day.
$2.5 billion daily.
That is not a number you can easily replace. Think of it visually. That's thousands of trucks, trains, pipelines, moving everything from finished cars to energy to raw materials, all constantly feeding the North American supply chain.
So any disruption to that flow isn't just an adjustment on some trade spreadsheet. It's a direct, visceral blow to Canadian businesses, to farmers, to workers.
Which is why the actions taken by the U.S. administration are being labeled so harshly.
People are calling it an economic assault.
And that characterization is warranted, I think, because of the systematic nature of the tariff regime that was imposed since the administration returned to office in March. It was very targeted and comprehensive.
Can you walk us through the stages of that? It wasn't just a single duty, was it?
No, not at all. It escalated rapidly. Initially, the U.S. imposed 25% tariffs on most Canadian imports, and then a specific 10% duty on energy imports.
Which right away would raise costs and create uncertainty.
Immediately. But they didn't stop there.
And then it got significantly tougher.
By August, those baseline tariffs were raised even higher, hitting 35% on many imports. Then you have the critical targeted sector attacks. Steel and aluminum, foundational materials for manufacturing, now face debilitating 50% duties.
50%.
Then, perhaps most damagingly, automobiles. This is a sector where the U.S., Canadian, and Mexican production lines are totally interwoven. They were hit with a 25% duty.
That integration in the auto sector is so key, isn't it? A car part can cross the border multiple times as it's being made and assembled. A 25% duty on that process must just paralyze production.
It's designed to paralyze it. It completely destroyed the efficiency that was gained through decades of integrated supply chain management.
So if your U.S. factory relies on a Canadian-made engine block,
And that block is suddenly 25% more expensive because of the tariff. The American manufacturer either has to absorb that cost, which is unlikely, or pass it on. And that makes the final product uncompetitive. The list of targets also included things like lumber and copper. It was a multi-sector attack designed to cause maximum leverage and, frankly, economic pain.
and what does the economic brain of Canada, the Bank of Canada, predict will happen if this pressure keeps up? I mean, they've run the models on this.
They have. And the numbers are truly alarming. If these tariffs persist at full force, the Bank of Canada predicts that Canadian GDP growth, the growth of their entire national economy, could be reduced by more than 3 percentage points.
3 percentage points. Okay, for the average listener, that sounds like a big number, but what does that actually mean in real economic terms? Why is a 3% reduction so catastrophic for a modern economy?
That is the right question to ask. In a typical year, a large, stable economy like Canada's might hope for, say, 1.5 to 2.5% growth.
So a reduction of 3 points.
It means that growth effectively evaporates and turns negative. This isn't just a slowdown. This pushes the economy deep into a potential recession. It means widespread contraction, it means freezing capital investment, and grinding business expansion to a halt.
And that, in turn, translates directly into jobs, doesn't it?
Directly. The economic model suggests that unemployment could rise by 2 to 3 percentage points across the country. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs put at immediate risk.
And these are jobs in manufacturing, resource extraction.
And all the supporting services. These are real families facing real hardship, all based on tariffs imposed by their largest, closest, and historically most trusted economic partner. It creates an environment of extreme economic duress.
And that duress is precisely what Washington was banking on to force a concession. It makes Prime Minister Carney's composure and his refusal to be rushed into a bad deal all the more extraordinary. He walked into that meeting knowing exactly what his country stood to lose.
Which leads us to Canada's counter-strategy. And I think this is a fascinating lesson in modern political and economic resilience. It wasn't about public anger or immediate retaliation.
No.
It was about quiet, dignified endurance. We could, characterize it as choosing dignity over desperation.
We saw a flash of that dignity right after the ceremony, didn't we? With that famous joke Carney made at the Canadian embassy.
Yes, the Paraguay anecdote. He was being lighthearted, referencing the World Cup draw, and he mentioned telling President Trump not to worry about Paraguay being placed in the U.S. group.
And then he joked.
He joked that these are just recommendations we have to sign off.
Let's just pause on that statement for a second. Why was that seemingly lighthearted joke actually a profound political statement?
Because the humor on the surface was masking a very clear assertion of sovereignty and equality. When he said, we have to sign off, he was subtly implying that the U.S., even while organizing a World Cup on its own soil, is not the sole authority.
It still needs buy-in from its partners.
It needs buy-in and sign-off. It was a clear, subtle message. Canada will not be pushed around, nor will it accept a humiliating deal purely on American terms just because America demands it. They chose patience over panic, believing they could weather the storm.
And that ability to be patient, to refuse to rush to the bargaining table, that's underpinned by something structural, isn't it? Something Canada has been quietly building for years.
Especially since the U.S. trade posture became more unpredictable. You're talking about economic diversification.
Exactly.
This is the real story of their long-term strategic shift. While the U.S. administration was focused on using tariffs for immediate gains, Canada was quietly working to reduce its dependency on the U.S. market. Think of it like an investor who realizes 75% of their money is in a single stock and decides to aggressively invest elsewhere to protect themselves from a crash.
And those investments are starting to pay off, giving them new leverage. What do the diversification numbers look like over the past year alone?
The change is significant. Exports to Europe, thanks in part to new trade deals, they increased by 22% in the past year.
22%.
Exports to Africa, a massive emerging market, rose by 18%. And exports to Central and South America climbed by 11%. These are not marginal gains. They are systematic shifts aimed at creating alternative pillars for their economy.
That's a remarkable pace of change, especially for a country that has been so historically focused on its southern border.
And the diplomatic infrastructure is there to support it. Canada now has 15 free trade agreements, FTAs, that cover 51 countries around the globe.
And what does that give them access to?
It gives Canadian companies preferential access to markets representing 61% of global GDP and 1.5 billion potential consumers. They are actively building a global economic foundation that does not run solely through Washington.
Now, let's be realistic. Can increasing exports to Africa and Europe fully replace the massive American market? It's right next door. It consumes 3/4 of everything they export. That seems impossible.
It is impossible to fully replace it. You're right. That proximity, that shared infrastructure, that deep integration, it can't be replicated overnight, if ever. The U.S. market will always be paramount. But you hit on the critical point. The goal of diversification is not necessarily replacement. It's about changing the negotiating dynamic.
How does having more trade deals fundamentally change that dynamic?
Well, as long as Canada was 100% dependent on American goodwill, the U.S. held a proverbial gun to Canada's head during any negotiation.
God, no.
Now, Canada has options, limited options, difficult options, but options nonetheless. They can afford to absorb some short-term pain, knowing they have growth pathways elsewhere. This means they are far less likely to just fold under pressure.
So that resilience, that economic ability to wait, is why Carney didn't blink at the Kennedy Center.
Exactly. They bought themselves time.
But while Canada is diversifying, the U.S. economy is also taking a hit. It's easy for trade rhetoric to sound like one side is winning, but the economic data suggests the U.S. is inflicting some significant self-harm here.
That is the great irony of using trade policy as a weapon against your closest ally. It's easy for political leaders to frame this as, we're punishing Canada to get a better deal.
Right.
But the basic economic mechanism of a tariff is fundamentally misunderstood or, perhaps misrepresented by those same leaders.
Let's clarify this point for our listeners because you hear this all the time. Why are tariffs effectively taxes on American households and not on Canada?
This is the core piece of clarity that's needed. The common conception, often repeated by the administration, is that Canada pays the tariff. This is simply and fundamentally false from an economic perspective. Tariffs are paid by American importers.
Well, if I'm a U.S. car manufacturer in Detroit and I want to import Canadian-made parts subject to a 25% duty, I'm the one writing a check to the U.S. Treasury, not the Canadian government.
Precisely. That duty is a tax on the importer. And that American importer is not just going to absorb a 25% cost increase, they immediately pass it along.
Down the chain.
To American manufacturers who pass it to distributors, who pass it to retailers, and eventually it ends up in the purchase price paid by the American consumer or the American business.
The Tax Foundation calculated the real cost of this tariff regime on American households. What did they find?
Their analysis was stark. They calculated that the current tariff regime amounts to an average tax increase of $1,200 per American household in the coming year, 2025.
$1,200? That's not a small number.
No. It places the current tariff rate structure at the highest level the country has seen since 1943. This is not a tax on Canada. It is a significant hidden tax on American families and businesses.
So when we talk about a $1,200 tax increase, how does that actually show up in an average American's life? Is it just higher car prices, more expensive groceries?
It's everywhere. When the tariff on steel is 50%, every piece of infrastructure, every new appliance, every piece of farm equipment built with that steel becomes more expensive. When lumber prices rise, the cost of building a home or renovating one goes up.
And for businesses?
For businesses, these tariffs increase operating costs, forcing them to either raise their own prices or reduce hiring and wages. It manifests as a slow, creeping inflation and reduced purchasing power across the board.
And the damage isn't just hitting consumers. Key American sectors that rely on a stable, friendly Canadian market are being seriously wounded. Let's talk about American farmers, for example.
American farmers are watching their largest, most reliable, and geographically closest export market shrink. Canada is a massive buyer of U.S. agricultural products.
And when the relationship becomes hostile?
Canada naturally starts to look for supply from elsewhere, from South America, from Europe, from its own domestic sources. American farmers are losing market share, and that uncertainty destabilizes their ability to plan for the long term.
And what about tourism? I know Canadian tourists traditionally spend a huge amount of money in the U.S. Places like Florida and Arizona in the winter, New York and California year-round.
It's a massive blow. Canadian tourists are the lifeblood of many U.S. travel economies. They spend upwards of $20 billion annually in the United States. They come for vacations, for shopping, for healthcare.
But now they're staying home?
They're staying home, or they're choosing to travel to places like Mexico or Europe instead. They're deterred by the instability, the exchange rate fluctuation caused by the tension, and just the general political climate.
And you have a real number attached to that tourism impact.
We do. Data suggests that even a modest 10% drop in Canadian tourism could directly threaten 140,000 American jobs.
140,000.
Primarily in retail, hospitality, and service sectors, mostly in border states and popular destinations. The irony is severe. By waging an economic war on your closest ally, you are directly inflicting massive self-harm on your own domestic job market.
It is truly remarkable that the administration seems to be ignoring the consensus of its own business community while pursuing this. Was there significant corporate dissent leading up to this?
There was widespread and unanimous corporate dissent. Just days before that World Cup draw, nearly 150 American business leaders, not academics or politicians, but CEOs and industry heads from agriculture, manufacturing, automotive, described, they all testified before the U.S. Trade Representative's office.
And what was their unified message?
It was crystal clear and unanimous. They called for the renewal and extension of CUSMA because it is, and I'm quoting here, essential to American prosperity.
So they were laying it all out.
They detailed the integration, the efficiency gains, the stability the agreement provides. They essentially gave the administration a roadmap, showing that these tariffs were counterproductive. And yet the administration chose to ignore the consensus of its own economic drivers, prioritizing political leverage over economic stability.
This choice to ignore the business community and incur self-harm? It suggests a real shift away from traditional economic thinking. It leads us to a broader philosophical point, the weaponization of trade.
That is exactly the right framing. We are seeing a significant departure from decades of trade policy philosophy.
It's no longer about mutual benefit.
No. Trade is no longer viewed through the lens of maximizing efficiency or increasing GDP or finding mutual benefit. It is strictly about punishment, leverage, and forcing compliance through economic pain. This radical shift turns allies into adversarial targets and long-standing agreements into tools of coercion.
And to justify this massive application of tariffs against Canada, a stalwart NATO ally, the administration has often relied on non-economic reasons, primarily the claim that Canada is flooding America with fentanyl. We have to analyze that claim based on the facts.
It's the most politically charged justification they have, but the data simply does not support it. The overwhelming majority of fentanyl entering the United States, according to the U.S. government's own drug interdiction figures, comes via the southern border.
And the northern border.
The northern border, in contrast, accounts for a tiny fraction of those drug interdiction efforts. Now, any illegal cross-border drug flow is a concern, obviously, but citing it as a justification for these sweeping punitive tariffs is a severe exaggeration.
And on top of that, Canadian authorities didn't just sit on their hands, did they? They cooperated extensively with U.S. requests to crack down on this.
They cooperated in full. Canada appointed a specific fentanyl czar to coordinate their national efforts. They significantly increased enforcement spending and cooperation with U.S. border agencies. They did everything the American administration asked.
And the response from Washington was?
The response was that it was not enough.
And the reason it wasn't enough, in your analysis, is because the tariffs were never really about security or stopping drugs. They were about leverage.
Precisely. The goal was to demonstrate American dominance and force Canadian concessions on completely unrelated economic terms, regardless of how much Canada cooperated on the security issue. This pattern highlights something even more troubling.
Which is?
Governance by grievance.
And you have a fascinating, almost unbelievable example of this.
I do, and it really crystallizes the political fragility of the current trade regime. At one point, the administration's threat to abandon CSMA entirely was directly linked to the fact that the provincial government of Ontario ran a small local advertisement.
An ad.
An ad that quoted former President Ronald Reagan criticizing the use of tariffs.
Wait. So trade negotiations worth hundreds of billions of dollars, affecting millions of jobs on both sides of the border, were jeopardized because a political ad made the president angry.
That appears to be exactly the case. I mean, think about the scale mismatch. The entire economic foundation of a continent held hostage over a provincial political slight that referenced a previous Republican president.
That's the definition of governance by grievance.
It is. It proves that economic stability is being sacrificed not for sound policy, but because an action made the president angry. In that kind of unpredictable environment, No trade agreement is secure. No partnership, no matter how long-standing, can be stable.
And we even saw this political weaponization try to creep into the supposedly non-political world of international sport right back at the World Cup drama. Even FIFA showed signs of resistance.
Absolutely. The politicization became so blatant that FIFA's own vice president, Victor Montaglani, who is Canadian, he had to step up.
What happened?
President Trump had suggested he could move World Cup games away from cities he deemed unsafe, specifically naming Seattle and San Francisco.
Cities run by Democrats.
Exactly. It was a clear attempt to use this global tournament as a tool for domestic political point scoring.
And what was Montaglani's response to the idea that a politician could just dictate where the world's biggest soccer tournament would be played?
His response was direct, and you could hear the frustration in it. He had to remind the administration publicly that FIFA, not any national government, ultimately decides where World Cup matches are played. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that football is bigger than them. Football will survive their regime and their government and their slogans.
That's powerful pushback from inside the organizing body itself.
It's a recognition of the danger of turning a global sporting event into a political bargaining chip.
So we have this extraordinary tension. Economic warfare, high-level diplomatic refusal, governance driven by political slights, and the ultimate symbol of cooperation, the World Cup looming large. This leads us to the critical timeline.
And the timing is what makes this a dramatic, unavoidable showdown. The World Cup and the trade agreement review are on a collision course.
Can you lay out that timeline for the listener?
Certainly. The World Cup tournament begins on June 11, 2026. The opening match is in Mexico City. The final whistle will blow at MetLife Stadium in New Jersey on July 19th.
And then?
Just weeks later, in July 2026, the mandatory CUSMA review comes due.
So the world's attention will be focused on North America, on cooperation, on security, on partnership. At the exact moment, the three governments have to decide whether to tear up the very trade agreement that made that cooperation possible. That's a massive stress test.
It is the moment of truth. At that July 2026 review, each country must declare whether it will extend the CUSMA deal for another 16 years, whether it intends to renegotiate, or whether it will withdraw entirely.
Imagine the spectacle. Millions of fans crossing the borders, supply chains managing the logistics of the tournament, and yet the underlying economic foundation is on the brink of collapse.
The entire event will either be a profound celebration of what works or a monument to severe dysfunction.
Meanwhile, the U.S. side has not been silent about its intentions. They've floated a clear strategy to weaken Canada's position, the divide and conquer threat.
That threat was detailed by President Trump's trade representative, Jameson Greer. The proposal is to break up CUSMA, the unified agreement, into separate bilateral deals, one with Canada, one with Mexico.
Classic negotiation tactics 101. Isolate your partners.
Exactly. You remove the power of unified negotiation and you force them into one-on-one concessions where the U.S. holds almost all the leverage.
And what has been Prime Minister Carney's strategic response to this threat of isolation?
He simply refuses to accept the premise of the debate. When he was asked by reporters if he was open to moving towards separate bilateral deals, Carney responded with a simple, firm denial. That is not what they are saying.
He's not even engaging with the idea.
By refusing to acknowledge the threat or even entertain the possibility, he denies the U.S. the ability to define the terms of the future debate. It's a powerful, quiet form of resistance that maintains the integrity of the three-country relationship.
The global implications of this dispute extend far beyond tariff schedules, don't they? This erosion of trust between such close allies is being noticed by the rest of the world, particularly by our rivals.
Absolutely. The world is watching every single step. If America can treat its closest neighbor and most reliable partner, Canada, a steadfast NATO ally whose troops have stood shoulder to shoulder with Americans in every major conflict since World War I, if they can treat them as an economic adversary to be punished, what does that signal to the world?
What message does that send to rivals like China and Russia?
It signals instability and unreliability. It undermines the entire architecture of international cooperation that the U.S. built over the last 70 years. It affects military alliances, it strains vital intelligence sharing, and it weakens the ability of democracies to coordinate against authoritarian rivals.
If the economic relationship between the U.S. and Canada is negotiable based on a political grievance,
then no alliance is truly secure.
the relationship has long been defined by the longest undefended border in the world. Is that status now in question?
It is in question philosophically, if not physically. This trade war creates an environment where that deep mutual trust is severely shaken. That border was only undefended because both nations trusted each other implicitly.
And if that trust is gone,
If economic stability can be sacrificed on a whim, the entire foundation of that partnership is undermined. This conflict puts the reliability of American global leadership squarely into question.
so the 2026 World Cup will unfold against this extraordinary backdrop of severe economic conflict, challenges to security cooperation, and supply chain strain. It's going to either become a profound monument to what was lost, a fractured partnership, or
Perhaps an opportunity for a forced reset, where the sheer necessity of running a successful global event forces cooperation over confrontation.
historians may well identify this World Cup moment not for the game on the pitch, but for what failed to happen in those negotiating rooms.
I think you're right. Prime Minister Carney rejected the deal, not dramatically, but effectively. He chose calculation and economic diversification over immediate concession. He flew home without giving the U.S. the political victory lap it clearly expected.
That courage to stand firm, even while risking a recession, it speaks volumes about a shifting geopolitical calculation in Ottawa. They seem to believe they can afford to wait.
They do. They have bet that their strategy of patient diversification can outlast the current U.S. administration's tariff regime.
And in the meantime,
In the meantime, businesses and workers on both sides of the border are suffering. Prices are rising, and long-term investment is being delayed. This conflict between two nations with decades of shared values and goals did not have to happen.
so what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you track current events on the global stage?
The lasting implication is this. The real contest is not on the football pitch. It is in the Treasury departments and the central banks, where the future of North American prosperity and the perceived reliability of American global leadership is being decided. The economic fate of these three interwoven nations, defined by CUSMA, is